Beneath the thick canopy of the Central American jungle, something extraordinary has been sleeping for over 1,000 years. Hidden beneath vines and earth lie cities larger than ancient Rome, built by a people who mapped the stars, invented zero, and ruled one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth. This is the story of the Maya and the secrets the jungle still keeps. With new laser technology, scientists are peeling back the jungle, revealing an empire we never truly knew existed.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. For centuries, the ancient Maya have existed in our collective imagination as, well, a civilization defined by these monumental, vine-covered ruins and this single catastrophic mystery. Why did they suddenly abandon these incredible cities? They're just utterly myth-shrouded.
And that shroud, until very recently, was entirely literal. Modern archaeology, really boosted by 21st century tech, is finally tearing that jungle away, digitally at least.
Right.
The sources we've gathered today, these are comprehensive archaeological reports, historical analyses, transcripts detailing cutting-edge discoveries. They reveal a culture far more expansive, sophisticated, and frankly, terrifyingly successful than we ever really imagined.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to strip away some of that mystique and dig deep into the hard evidence. We want to look at the Maya's vast economic, scientific, social achievements, focusing heavily on the scale of their infrastructure, their intellectual genius, and then grappling with the complex, multifaceted reasons for their eventual political collapse. We're taking a deep dive into the evidence of this really powerful, long-lasting culture.
And if you want a shock factor right out of the gate, just consider the scale. What's been revealed just in the last, say, 2 decades, those isolated, picturesque ruins you might have visited.
Yeah, the ones you see in photos.
They represented maybe 10%, if that, of the actual urban fabric. It's only with modern laser technology, LiDAR, that we've truly grasped that their largest cities were gigantic metropolises, completely hidden under the dense jungle canopy.
Oh.
This shifts our entire understanding. It goes from isolated city-states to something potentially much more unified, a massive power structure, especially early on.
Okay, let's unpack this monumental shift in historical understanding, because it's entirely dependent on technology, specifically this LiDAR. You mentioned back in the 1930s, when survey pilots first flew over that massive border region, Guatemala and Mexico. They just saw a seemingly endless sea of green, punctuated only by what they confidently assumed were, like, natural hills, or maybe small, extinct volcanic cones.
They were utterly mistaken, but you can see why, right? What they were actually seeing were these immense pyramids, massive fortifications, complex hydraulic systems, all structures entirely covered by, 1,000 years of rainforest growth. The jungle just molds itself around the ruins.
So it just looks like landscape.
Exactly. And LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, that changed everything.
Okay, describe how that technology provides the key, because it almost sounds like science fiction, mapping through dense jungle.
Well, it functions by firing literally billions of laser pulses per second down through the vegetation. Now, crucially, a tiny percentage of those pulses actually hit the ground surface beneath the leaves and branches. Specialized GPS sensors record the return time of those specific ground-hit pulses, and then powerful computers essentially stitch all that data together. This lets archaeologists digitally remove the jungle canopy, like peeling back a layer.
Wow.
And generate a comprehensive 3-dimensional map of the terrain below. And the precision is just astonishing.
And the results were? Well, revolutionary seems like an understatement. Archaeologists like Richard Hansen, focusing on the Mirador Basin region, suddenly they saw thousands of ruins revealed where they had only previously seen, uniform green jungle.
Right. This technology allowed him and his team to finally comprehend the true mind-boggling dimensions of these pre-classic cities, especially El Mirador.
El Mirador, that's the big one from this early period.
It's really the cornerstone of this new understanding of Maya antiquity. Hansen's research confirmed that organized settlement there began astonishingly early. We're talking as far back as 1000 BC.
1000 BC.
Yeah. This places the foundation of these immense ruins centuries before many of the later, more famous classic period sites were even established. We're looking at a civilization much older, much earlier in its monumentality than previously cataloged.
And when we talk about scale, we have to talk about the sheer audacity of the structures there. Specifically, the Ladanta Pyramid. This structure, standing 72 meters high, The sources describe it as one of the most powerful and demanding structures of the ancient world.
It's enormous.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and this gives you that sense of scale. Hansen's meticulous volumetric calculations show Ladanta is physically larger than the Great Pyramid of Cheops in Egypt.
By volume, yes. That comparison is crucial because it speaks volumes about the organization required. It's not just the height, it's the sheer mass of material they had to move and put in place.
And what makes this an incredible feat of engineering, as you dig into it, is understanding what the Maya did not have at their disposal. They had no draft animals, right? No horses, no cattle.
None. Those only arrived 2,000 years later with the Spanish conquistadors.
And furthermore, no wheel used as a transport aid. They knew the concept. Apparently it appeared in small toys, but not for hauling stone.
Correct. No carts, no wagons, and no pulley system for lifting these massive stones high into the air. And critically, for shaping and quarrying, they had no metal tools. No iron, no bronze.
So this entire volumetric superstructure, bigger than Cheops, was built using, what, sheer human manpower?
Sheer human manpower, leverage, lots of rope, and incredible organizational ingenuity. To realize that scale of structure, you have to think about the logistics. The estimation is that constructing Ladanta required approximately 4,000 laborers, working daily, continuously, for 30 years straight.
30 years. 4,000 people every day. In a hostile jungle environment. That implies a level of central political organization, resource control, supply chain management. It's nearly incomprehensible for that era and that geography.
It really is.
How do you keep 4,000 people fed, supplied with material, motivated for 3 decades? It strongly suggests an utterly centralized government structure, way earlier than we thought.
Exactly. And this labor built a gigantic, organized metropolis. The laser scans didn't just reveal pyramids in oscillation, they showed integrated systems. Extensive elevated terraces for housing, complex defensive walls surrounding the center, massive remnants of specialized animal pens, huge reservoirs for water management. El Mirador was engineered as a kind of garden city.
And the reconstruction confirms that, doesn't it? Plantations and orchards weren't just pushed to the outer fringes, they were integrated, extending far out into the surrounding area, indicating a planned, maybe even sustainable, urban environment.
Yes, planned is the key word. The population estimates that came out of this are just staggering for the pre-Roman era. Over 250,000 people lived in the central core alone.
250,000.
Supported by potentially another million in the immediate surrounding dependent area.
Wow.
So, to put that into the required historical context, El Mirador was unquestionably one of the largest cities in the entire world before Rome became a superpower.
Before Rome.
Its influence extended throughout the region. The LiDAR mapping revealed it was linked to neighboring settlements via this sophisticated 2,000-year-old network of long-distance raised roads, paved causeways called Sakbiib. This wasn't just a big city, it was the capital of a true pre-classic superpower.
Right, and that vast scale, that massive population, over 1 million people potentially relying on this center, required an equally vast and complex economic engine to keep it running. It couldn't subsist purely on local farming around the edges.
Makes sense.
The city centers weren't just religious or administrative sites. They were bustling, carefully managed economic hubs. Huge public squares, palaces, temples, and crucially, massive open-air markets.
This speaks to a deeply sophisticated economy. Driven by intense specialization, I assume. You'd have long-distance traders coming in?
Absolutely. Converging with local craftsmen, specialized quarry workers, dedicated farmers bringing surpluses, and how regulated was this system?
Highly regulated. Sources describe a powerful hierarchy of officials. Their primary job seems to have been monitoring and controlling the market. They collected tributes or taxes on goods, they ensured fair exchange rates, and crucially, they managed the flow of essential, non-local commodities, things necessary for survival and construction that you couldn't just get nearby.
Right, you need to bring things in. So what were the most valuable goods traveling along those 2,000-year-old roads? What were they trading?
Well, on the essential side, they relied heavily on obsidian, that volcanic glass. It was so highly prized because of its unique properties. Weapon makers, tool makers valued it for knives and axes because, remarkably, sources indicate that a freshly flaked obsidian blade is harder and sharper than modern surgical steel.
Get out. Sharper than surgical steel.
That's what the analysis suggests. This was their cutting-edge technology, literally.
That fact alone is incredible. A Stone Age tool sharper than stainless steel. Okay. Moving beyond essentials, what about luxury and symbolic goods? What reveals their specific cultural values?
They traded extensively in luxury items that symbolize life, status, and power. Things like spiny oysters and their shells, harvested from the distant coasts, were high-end status symbols. But even more valuable, it seems, were the bright green feathers of the quetzal bird, which only came from specific highland regions.
Ah, green. Green was the color of life for them, wasn't it? Like green jade, which they valued almost like gold in the old world.
Precisely. Jade was immensely important. And in this vibrant market, perhaps the most intriguing item economically might be the cacao bean.
Chocolate. Well, the basis of it.
Yes, but it wasn't just a raw material. It was actually functioning currency, used for all levels of transaction, from small purchases to potentially larger tribute payments.
Cacao beans were literally money. Yet they were also the ingredient for cacao, their intense, bitter drinking chocolate, which was a delicacy, right? Usually reserved only for the nobility.
Yes, exactly. This is a perfect illustration of complex social stratification. You have a highly desired, culturally significant food item that simultaneously functions as the standard medium of exchange. It directly links economic power to social standing and reinforces the exclusivity of the elites. What the analyses really underline is that the Maya developed an economic and social system unlike pretty much anything else seen in the Western Hemisphere at that time. It was incredibly complex.
So we have the economy, the trade, the hierarchy. Now let's turn to the spiritual foundation that really held this centralized society together. The ancestor cult. The sources describe this belief that the dead literally lived among them. Maintaining continuous contact wasn't just like a comfort, but a social necessity.
It was an intimate, direct, and continuous relationship. The Maya often buried their revered ancestors within the floor or walls of the house structure itself, under the living space.
Right inside the house.
Yes. The goal was to ensure the dead remained functional, spiritual members of the immediate family unit. They were still part of the household. We have a particularly fascinating find from a grave excavation that illustrates this commitment. A skull discovered next to a ceramic bowl.
And that bowl wasn't just an offering vessel for, say, food. It had a specifically engineered hole pierced in the bottom. Why?
The belief, archaeologists suggest, was that the bowl was placed near or even over the face to act as a kind of metaphysical pathway. It allowed the soul, or life essence, of the ancestor to enter and exit through that hole, ensuring they remained connected to the living family and could potentially influence their fate or receive offerings. This practice shows a really unique intimacy with death, very different from how we often view it.
That intimacy is truly jarring compared to modern Western practices anyway. Was that commitment to connection pushed further through self-sacrifice among the living?
It seems so. The same grave, that same context, contained a small bowl filled with small, fragmented human finger bones.
Finger bones.
Yes. This finding strongly suggests ritual self-mutilation or perhaps bloodletting performed by the relatives. This wasn't necessarily seen as a punitive act, but more likely an extreme powerful act of devotion. Sacrificing a bit of the physical self, perhaps blood or even small bones, to stay eternally united with the deceased ancestor. Ritual was profoundly physical and intimate, and it clearly enforced social cohesion through these shared spiritual obligations.
Okay, all these complex systems, the massive cities, the luxury trade, the elaborate burial rites, and especially that monumental labor required for cities like El Mirador, they all require immense, stable resources. And that brings us back to the central mystery that plagued early researchers, the food paradox.
Yeah.
How did 1 million+ people thrive long-term in a tropical rainforest environment, which has notoriously nutrient-poor, thin soil? Other high cultures failed in similar environments.
Right. The key to that paradox, and really evidence of their agricultural genius, was preserved entirely by disaster, almost like a snapshot. We have the incredible discovery of Joya de Seren in El Salvador. It's often called the Pompeii of the Maya. This was a small, unassuming farming village, suddenly buried under meters of volcanic ash around 660 AD.
So, like Pompeii, the eruption froze a precise moment in time. But instead of grand villas and temples, it preserved the minutiae of daily agricultural life.
Precisely that. The ash layers conserved the exact layout of the fields, the storage facilities, and even left hollow spaces like molds where the plants once stood. Their shape perfectly preserved.
Incredible.
This provided indisputable physical evidence of their systematic and highly effective farming techniques that were the absolute key to feeding their vast empire, and which centered entirely around one miraculous crop. And the heart of that agricultural success, the absolute foundation of their very identity, was maize, corn. For the Maya, maize wasn't just food. It was their primary energy source, and it was sacred beyond measure.
The mythology ties this directly to their identity, doesn't it? The Maya saw themselves as the maize people. They believed they were literally formed by the gods from maize dough in their central creation myth.
Yes, it's fundamental to who they believed they were. But the reality of maize cultivation is an evolutionary feat that modern scientists still marvel at.
How so?
Well, it truly is one of humanity's greatest achievements in genetic domestication. The wild ancestor of maize is a plant called teosinte. It's basically an unassuming wild grass with these hard shells around the kernels, relatively few nutrients in those kernels, and critically, the kernels scatter naturally to propagate themselves.
Right, like most wild grasses.
But cultivated maize, the corn we know, is unique. It cannot propagate without direct human help. The seeds are locked onto the cob. They simply don't detach or disperse naturally. You have to physically remove them and plant them.
Ah, so that switch, forcing total dependence on human interaction, meant the crop was essentially a cooperative partner. It ensured that farmers could harvest and store the food reliably when they needed it without losing it all back to the wild.
Exactly. But the transition from teosinte to the high-yield, nutritious staple we recognize today required systematic and, frankly, brilliant selective breeding over millennia. They had to identify desirable traits and carefully cultivate them generation after generation.
And that effort paid off massively.
Oh, absolutely. Genetic analysis confirms this domestication was one of humanity's most significant agricultural achievements. It's maybe equivalent to transforming a basic wild shrub into a super efficient energy source. If the original discoverer or developer of maize were working today, they would undoubtedly deserve a Nobel Prize.
Wow.
It offered extremely high caloric yields in a relatively short amount of time, often just 2 to 3 months after planting in that tropical climate.
But securing the food supply long-term, especially in that nutrient-poor rainforest environment, wasn't just about the crop itself. It was about the method, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned they weren't doing monocultures like we often see today.
Correct. Unlike the vast, often resource-draining monocultures we rely on now, the ancient Maya practiced an incredibly sustainable form of polyculture agriculture.
Polyculture.
Yes, planting multiple crops together. We often call this today the Three Sisters technique. They had perfected this maybe 1,000 to 1,500 years ago, completely without chemical fertilizers or significant external energy inputs. They planted maize, beans, and squash together in the same small plot, the milpa.
Okay, explain that synergy. How did these three specific plants interact to basically defy the limitations of tropical soil?
The symbiosis is just brilliant. First, the tall, strong maize stalk acts as a natural climbing support, like a living trellis, for the viney bean plants, so the beans can grow upwards towards the sun.
Okay, structural support.
Second, and this is the real ecological genius, the beans are legumes, powerful nitrogen fixers. They draw atmospheric nitrogen from the air and convert it into compounds in the soil through nodules on their roots. This provides the necessary nutrient boost, the nitrogen that the very nitrogen-hungry maize needs to thrive, especially in poor tropical soil.
So the beans feed the corn?
Pretty much, yes. And finally, the squash completes the trifecta. The large, sprawling leaves of the squash plant spread out close to the ground, acting as a living mulch. They shade the soil, keeping it cooler and retaining moisture. They protect it from the intense sun, and critically, in a region prone to heavy tropical storms, they protect the soil surface from the impact of heavy rain. This prevents both soil erosion and suppresses weed growth.
That's incredible. It's a self-sustaining little ecosystem.
Exactly. This entire system provided the massive food surpluses necessary for that enormous population growth we talked about, and it enabled the specialization, the craftsmen, the priests, the long-distance traders, the astronomers that characterized their civilization.
That level of ecological competence achieved so long ago is just staggering. Okay, so once that food foundation was secure, the population exploded, and their intellectual achievements during the Classic period, that's roughly 400 to 800 AD, were equally revolutionary. This was the era where they were masters of architecture, astronomy, and crucially, mathematics.
And their greatest mathematical invention, arguably one of the greatest conceptual inventions of humanity, full stop, was the zero.
The concept of nothingness as a number.
Yes. The Maya were almost certainly the first civilization in the world to invent not just the concept, but a written symbol for zero, and crucially, to use it as a placeholder in computation. They represented it with a simple, stylized, oval shell symbol.
And that context is incredibly important, isn't it? Because neither the ancient Greeks nor the Romans utilized the concept of zero in their numeral systems, which severely limited their ability to calculate large numbers or do complex math easily.
Absolutely. Europeans didn't really start using the zero effectively until the 12th century, having borrowed it indirectly from India via the Islamic world.
Yet the Maya had mastered it centuries earlier, and the zero was absolutely vital for them because they used a vigesimal or base 20 numeral system.
Right. Unlike Roman numerals, which are additive, like x plus I is 11, the Maya used a positional place value system, much like ours, but based on 20 instead of 10, without the zero to denote an empty place value like in our number 10, where the zero holds the one's position. Complex calculations and especially high accuracy astronomy would be utterly impossible.
So the zero wasn't just some abstract philosophical concept for them. It was a practical tool that powered their entire civilization's understanding of the cosmos and time.
Precisely. They immediately put this sophisticated mathematical knowledge to use in their astronomical observations.
Which were incredibly accurate.
Astonishingly so. They calculated the precise movements of planets like Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and even tracked comets. They predicted celestial events like eclipses with an accuracy that still impresses modern astronomers. And remember, this was all done without the aid of any telescopes or advanced optical equipment, just naked eye observation and brilliant math.
And we get a stunning window into this specific knowledge through the Dresden Codex. You mentioned only 4 Maya manuscripts survived the destruction wrought by the Spanish.
Tragically few, yes.
And the Dresden Codex functioned essentially as a kind of manual for priests and scholars.
That's right. It allowed them to track celestial phenomena because, for the Maya, the heavenly bodies were powerful gods. Their meticulously calculated movements weren't just interesting. They predicted fate, fortune, harvests, drought, war, everything. Expert translators confirm this codex gives us a direct look into the complex, interconnected worldview of the Maya intellectual class.
The sources mention a specific high-stakes application found in the codex, the Venus table. Now, for us, Venus is the goddess of love, but for the Maya.
For the Maya, Venus was often seen as a powerful, often malevolent war god. Its position in the sky, its heliacal rising, for instance, was critically important.
Why?
Because its position dictated military strategy. The Venus table allowed priests to determine whether a specific day or period was favorable or unfavorable to launch a war, to attack a neighboring city-state, or perhaps even when to conduct certain rituals associated with warfare or kingship. Astronomy was, quite literally, woven into military and political planning.
Wow. Okay, so to manage these celestial gods and their influences, they required systems of timekeeping that were equally complex and interwoven. They used 3 interconnected calendars simultaneously, like a set of interlocking gears, tracking time across multiple scales.
That's a good analogy. First, we have the Hab, which was their solar calendar, based quite accurately on the Earth's orbit around the sun. It had 365 days, just like ours, but the sources confirm the Maya calculated the length of the solar year much more accurately than contemporary European systems. Down to 3 decimal places, in fact.
More accurate than the Julian calendar used in Europe at the time.
Significantly so. Then there was the Tzolk'in, the sacred divination calendar. This was a shorter cycle of 260 days, combining 20 named days with 13 sacred numbers. This was used primarily for scheduling rituals, for divination, for determining auspicious dates for major life events.
Like a ritual almanac.
Exactly. And finally, linking everything together across vast stretches of time was the long count. This system allowed them to track enormous periods, placing current events, reigns of kings, and celestial events into a huge historical and cosmological framework stretching back thousands of years. It was their tool for deep history and prophecy.
Okay, and for the record, we really must address the most popularized and frankly distorted myth surrounding this calendar system. The whole 2012 apocalypse prediction. The sources are crystal clear on this, aren't they?
That's right.
The Dresden Codex did not predict the end of the world on December 21st, 2012.
No, absolutely not. That was a massive modern misinterpretation, fueled largely by New Age concepts and end-time hysteria, completely alien to Maya thought. The Codex was simply detailing the transition point from one vast calendar period, a cycle called a Baktun, to the next one.
Just the turning of a cosmic odometer, essentially.
Pretty much. It specifically predicted associated events, things like rain and floods, possibly related to the changing cycle, but certainly not cosmological annihilation. It was always about cycles, destruction, and recreation, perhaps, but fundamentally about continuity, not some final end.
Okay, so given that the precise movement of the stars dictated political success, military strategy, harvests, fate itself, It's easy to understand why ritual was so profoundly central to Maya governance. For the Maya, the sources state pretty clearly that the most important task of the kings was not politics as we might understand governance today, making laws, managing resources day to day, but the performance of meticulously timed, often very public rituals.
Ritual was politics. It was the core function of kingship. The king's essential job, his primary responsibility, was to sustain the universe. He did this by feeding and pleasing the gods through these rituals, thereby guaranteeing the essential components of life, sun, rain, fertility, the success of maize for his people. If the gods didn't get what they needed, the universe, and thus the kingdom itself, would falter and fail.
This relied on that core belief you mentioned, in a latent equilibrium, like a cosmic balancing act. The gods give things necessary for life, rain, fertility, the maize itself, but only if humans give back in equal or maybe even greater measure. So what was the ultimate offering? The most potent representation of life force they could give?
Blood. Blood was considered the very seed of the soul, the essence of life force itself, and therefore it was the most potent, most precious food for the gods. And royal blood, coming from a king believed to have divine lineage, was the most valuable offering of all.
And this belief led to some of the most, well, harrowing procedures described in the sources. To secure the gods' support at critical times, like planting season or during a drought or before a war, rulers undertook extreme rituals that were often performed publicly.
They were extreme acts of self-sacrifice, yes. Archaeological findings, depictions on stelae and murals, they detail procedures sometimes involving the piercing of the ruler's own tongue or ears, or even their penis with a sharp implement, like a sharpened bone, a stingray spine, or a sharp obsidian blade.
That sounds incredibly painful.
Undoubtedly. Sources suggest they often used hallucinogenic drugs, perhaps from plants or toad secretions, to help endure the pain and possibly achieve a trance state, enhancing the connection to the divine.
And the purpose of this self-inflicted wounding was to collect the divine blood.
Yes, exactly. The royal blood was collected often onto strips of bark paper. These blood-soaked papers were then burned in ritual braziers. As the paper turned to ash and the smoke rose towards the heavens, that smoke was considered the ultimate spiritual sustenance, the literal food for the gods. This painful personal act of giving their own life force at a crucial moment was how the king sought divine support. But just as importantly, it visibly proved his legitimacy and his power to the watching populace. He was the one who could bleed for them and commune with the gods.
They didn't just perform these intense acts, they staged them very publicly, using architecture itself to reinforce their divine connection and their perceived control over the cosmos. The most famous example, of course, is at Chichen Itza, the Kukulkan Pyramid, also known as El Castillo.
Right. The Kukulkan Pyramid is just a masterful piece of architectural propaganda, if you will. It was built with such precise astronomical orientation and geometry that twice a year, exactly on the spring and autumn equinoxes, the shadow of the setting sun plays across the pyramid's northern staircase,
Creating this perfect serpentine illusion.
Exactly. The shadows form triangles that make it look exactly like a massive serpent, representing the feathered serpent god Kukulkan, is sliding down the staircase from the temple at the top to the carved serpent head at the bottom.
And that spectacle, witnessed by potentially thousands in the plaza below, was a colossal political tool, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Kings who could precisely predict and literally stage these kinds of celestial events, like that serpent's descent, were demonstrating to everyone that they had a special working relationship with the gods, that they had mastery over time and the cosmos itself, this guaranteed popular submission, awe, and it legitimized their often quite tyrannical rule.
But what happened during times of extreme crisis, when the cosmic order seemed to break down unexpectedly, like during a solar or lunar eclipse, which they apparently saw as terrifying omens of disaster? Did the cost of appeasement rise then?
It seems it did, dramatically. That's likely when the royal bloodletting sometimes escalated into full human sacrifice. Typically, the victims were captured enemy warriors, maybe nobles from rival city-states, sometimes even members of the king's own court or family in extreme cases. The sources, both archaeological and textual, like the codices, describe these sacrifices as frantic, dramatic public stagings. They were designed to shock the system, essentially, to hold the people in the thrall of the rulers, demonstrate ultimate power, and desperately try to avert what they believed was impending total doom brought on by the gods' displeasure.
Okay, now we arrive at the difficult, perhaps the most famous, part of the Maya story: the collapse. But what many people don't realize, based on the sources, is that the Maya arguably had not one, but two major collapses, separated by centuries. The first one happened incredibly early, long before the famous classic period decline we usually hear about. This was the rapid fall of that magnificent early city we discussed, El Mirador, around 150 AD.
That's right. The archaeological evidence there is just a stark warning sign frozen in time. You find these large, obviously unfinished pyramids and platforms where construction just stopped mid-project.
They could just drop their tools and left.
Pretty much. The work crews vanished, the quarries fell silent, and the city was systematically abandoned, never to be reoccupied at anything close to its former scale. Richard Hansen and his team, based on extensive excavation and environmental analysis, believe the primary cause was essentially self-inflicted environmental suicide.
Environmental suicide, how?
The culprit, it appears, was their relentless hunger for limestone stucco. That brilliant white, high-quality plaster they used to coat, decorate, and finish their glorious pyramids, temples, palaces, even house floors.
Okay, they needed plaster. Why was that suicidal?
Because making it was incredibly and ultimately unsustainably resource-intensive. To produce just 1 ton of the needed white lime powder for the stucco mortar, the Maya had to burn an astonishing 5 tons of wood.
5 tons of wood for 1 ton of plaster.
Yes. They needed incredibly hot fires for a long time to properly calcine the raw limestone in massive kilns. Now, when you consider the sheer scale and volume of the structures at El Mirador Ladanta Pyramid alone is immense, that process demanded astronomical amounts of deforestation in what was already a highly fragile tropical ecosystem.
And the sources show that this problem actually grew exponentially worse over time, didn't it?
Yep.
Driven by this relentless pursuit of grandeur, of bigger and brighter buildings.
Exactly. Initially, the floor coverings and stucco layers on buildings might have been relatively thin, perhaps 3 to 4 centimeters thick, which is functional. But by around 0 AD, archaeological layers show they were routinely laying stucco layers 13 centimeters thick or even more.
13 centimeters. That's like 5 inches of solid plaster.
Yes. It's an entirely unnecessary, incredibly wasteful consumption of wood, stone, and labor. It seems driven purely by a need for ever-increasing monumental size and visual impact. Prestige, political one-upmanship, maybe?
So driven by this relentless demand for visibility and prestige, they cleared larger and larger areas of the surrounding forest to feed these stucco kilns. The political ambition directly drove the ecological catastrophe.
That seems to be the inescapable conclusion. The consequence was catastrophic and relatively immediate in geological terms. Deforestation on that scale exposed the naked, thin tropical soil to the intense sun and, more importantly, to the torrential tropical storms common in the region.
No tree roots to hold it.
Exactly. Without the forest canopy and the root systems to bind it, this led to massive soil erosion. The rains washed away the thin, fertile topsoil into the bajos, the seasonal swamps, rendering the agricultural land infertile. Crop yields plummeted across the vast area needed to support the city. The inhabitants of El Mirador had, quite literally, destroyed the environmental basis for their own massive civilization.
They had no choice but to leave.
They had to migrate, likely moving to surrounding areas and eventually contributing to the rise of cities further north in the Yucatan Peninsula.
Wow. That serves as such a potent early warning about the dangerous link between political ambition, wasteful resource consumption, and environmental collapse, a lesson they seemingly didn't fully learn.
Apparently not, because 500 or 600 years later, the classic period Maya civilization, having rebuilt and expanded spectacularly across the Yucatan and into the southern lowlands, faced its own ultimate, more widespread crisis. This time triggered primarily, it seems, by severe, prolonged climate change.
We're talking now about the 9th century AD, the famous classic Maya collapse. Paleoclimate evidence from lake sediments, cave formations, it shows severe, century-long droughts struck the region repeatedly during this period.
Yes, multiple intense droughts lasting decades at a time. This was devastating, especially in regions like the Yucatan Peninsula, which already has a severe natural water scarcity problem. Because the bedrock there is porous limestone, there are absolutely no surface rivers or lakes of any significance.
Not at all.
Virtually none. Their entire survival, especially for large populations, depended entirely on cenotes. These are the deep, water-filled sinkholes and natural caverns created where the limestone bedrock has collapsed, exposing the groundwater table below.
Okay.
These cenotes were the only large, reliable natural water reserves. And so, naturally, they were viewed as incredibly sacred places, the physical home of Cheak, the powerful Maya rain god.
So as the droughts dragged on, year after year, decade after decade, the desperation must have been unimaginable. And we know something about the measures they took because of what's been found in those cenotes, right?
Yes. Underwater archaeologists, systematically exploring these sacred cenotes today, have found not just offerings like jade and pottery, but numerous human skulls and bones. Many of these bear clear signs of ritual sacrifice or mutilation, and distressingly, a significant number belong to children and young adults.
They were sacrificing people, including children, to the rain god in the cenotes.
It appears so. In their desperation, the Maya were sacrificing the most valuable thing they had, their young, their future, in a frantic, escalating attempt to appease Cheak and make the rains return. They were upholding their side of the cosmic covenant, offering the ultimate price. But the god, this time, failed to respond. The climate pattern had shifted beyond their ritual control.
The sacrifices were ineffective. The climate change, the drought, persisted. The water levels in cenotes dropped. And the king's ultimate, non-negotiable promise, the guarantee to deliver divine favor and life-giving rain, was brutally and publicly broken, year after year.
And that ancient necessary pact, the social contract between the divine rulers and the people, was fundamentally shattered. The ongoing climate crisis provided the fuel, the catalyst, for massive political upheaval across the Maya world.
And the sources indicate that, even as things were falling apart, the elites in many cities continued their luxurious existence, maybe performing ever more frantic rituals, but seemingly ignoring the clear signs of environmental and social collapse happening just outside their palace walls.
There's evidence suggesting that, yes, a disconnect between the rulers and the ruled, exacerbated by the crisis. This disconnect, combined with starvation and resource wars, escalated rapidly into widespread political chaos and eventually outright civil war between competing cities and likely internal revolt as well.
And we see the results archaeologically.
We do. We see evidence of mass violence, hastily built fortifications around previously open cities, kings being violently overthrown, their monuments defaced or destroyed, and once almighty ruling families being driven out, killed, or disappearing from the record. The survivors, the common people, fled the collapsing cities, scattering into the smaller villages or the jungle fringes.
So what is absolutely critical to understand here, based on the evidence, is that what truly collapsed was the political system. The system of the centralized god kings, the major city centers, the elite hierarchies, and the elaborate ritual structure that supported them.
Exactly. The people themselves, the Maya people, did not vanish off the face of the earth, despite the popular myth. The farmers, the people who actually sustained the culture for millennia with their ingenious agriculture and their resilient local traditions, they lived on, they adapted.
And that continuity is precisely why the Maya culture endures so strongly today, isn't it? There are over 6 million people identifying as Maya, descendants of this ancient civilization living today in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras.
Yes. Their persistence, their resilience is what truly differentiates them from some other great ancient cultures like, say, the Romans or the ancient Egyptians whose direct cultural and political lineage was more definitively broken. Many Maya communities have retained aspects of their language, their beliefs, their agricultural practices, creating a continuous, though obviously changed and adapted, cultural link stretching all the way from the pre-classic era to the present day. #outro.
So let's just quickly recap some of the key insights from this deep dive into the Maya. We started by metaphorically tearing away the jungle with LiDAR, revealing the truly unprecedented scale of early cities like El Mirador, a genuine superpower before Rome, whose fall showed us how unchecked political ambition could lead directly to self-inflicted ecological destruction. Pretty sober.
We then celebrated the staggering intellectual genius of the classic period Maya, their independent invention of the zero, which is fundamental to modern math. Their incredibly precise, interwoven calendar systems that tracked cosmic time, and maybe most importantly, the world-changing invention of truly sustainable agriculture through that elegant Three Sisters technique.
And we ended by analyzing the dual collapse. First, El Mirador's self-inflicted ecological crisis, seemingly driven by wasteful stucco consumption for prestige, followed centuries later by the broader classic period collapse, a lethal combination of sustained, severe climate change, drought, and the ultimate failure of their political and religious system, the God Kings, to cope with that existential environmental stress.
And the downfall of the classic Maya, particularly, serves as an incredibly powerful, detailed, and frankly relevant case study for us today, doesn't it? It demonstrates with chilling clarity exactly how sustained climate change, when combined with factors like environmental degradation, resource competition, and perhaps a rigid political elite unwilling or unable to change course, can fatally influence the trajectory of even the most sophisticated and highly advanced civilizations. It's almost a roadmap of potential disaster.
A disturbing parallel, perhaps. The ancient Maya held this profound cyclical philosophy. They believed they were like the sun setting in the evening, journeying through the underworld, only to rise again, renewed in the morning. Considering that the modern Maya people are still here, many actively re-engaging with their profound heritage, their languages, their traditions, that sophisticated yet ultimately fragile connection to the natural world, what lessons from their incredible rise and their devastating fall should modern global societies remember as we face our own accelerating climate challenges today? That's a powerful question to maybe think about long after the sun sets today.